You know, people say one of the worst circumstances you can get yourself involved in is a divorce. But my guest today, Brian Steinberg, has an alternative. I mean, it doesn't have to be that bad or contentious, does it?
No, it doesn't. And what I'm going to be talking about today with you is divorce mediation.
Okay, when you say mediation, okay, two people aren't getting along. What typically happens is that they each rush to see their own attorneys, and then, you know, the fight ensues, and there's litigation and judges and courts and money and years and anger going on.
Well, generally speaking, what will happen is one of the parties will come into me prior to the other party going to see another attorney, and I will tell them the options. And most of them were not aware that they could do a mediation, or they could do litigation. And a lot of times they will say, well, you know, I do think we'd be able to sit down with each other. There's three things I look for. Mm-hmm. First, are you able to be in the same room with each other without, I make fun of it a little bit, and I go, without killing each other literally or figuratively, and I've actually seen people kind of get into it with each other. The second one, are you able to disclose, and are you willing to act in good faith? That's part of the disclosure process. And the third is really important as well, is do you both feel strongly that you'd rather make decisions for your children and your financial lives rather than having a judge tell you what you have to do?
Now, I know from my friends that handle divorces that when the judge is making a decision, typically neither party's happy.
You know, it's very interesting, but the judges are oftentimes taught that if both parties walk away feeling like they got a bad result, then they've done their job. And it doesn't have to be that way, because in mediation I find I'm able to achieve, in most instances, a win-win where both parties feel like they're happy with the result when we get done with it.
Mm-hmm. And so your law practice, you know, essentially deals with mediation. And take me through it, okay? You get a phone call. I call you and say, you know, Mr. Steinberg, you know, I'm contemplating getting divorced. I don't want to have children, have a little business. I don't want to, you know, be angry, or, you know, well, because I have to deal with my children and my ex for X number, you know, for the rest of their lives. You know, and my wife and I want to try to resolve this as best as we can. How can you help us?
All right, well, sometimes I'll get both parties come in, and they'll have you know, done a little research and found out, you know, that I do mediation. Mm-hmm. And they'll come in and I'll explain the process to them. And invariably, if they're both there at the same time, I'm pretty confident that that's what we're going to do, because once they hear how this process works over how litigation works, they really don't want to do litigation. And most of them feel pretty strongly, especially when there's kids, that they want to be able to be in the same room with the other party for school events, religious events, later marriages, or maybe even once a week they might get together and have a family dinner.
Right.
So these parties have understood that they can do this in a way that is fair, and in a way that leaves them in a position to be able to deal with each other, you know, normally and without anger, for the sake of the children.
Mm-hmm. And how would I know what is fair? Let's say we have a little retail business,
right?
And you know, at its little store, it, you know, generates X dollars of compensation weekly from my spouse and I, and then now we're getting divorced and we got to split it up. How do we know what's fair?
Well, what we do is we're able to do pretty much everything in a mediation context that we would do in a litigation context. Like I said, it is very important that people in this venue are able to make informed and intelligent decisions. And one way we might do that is to get a business appraiser, mm-hmm. and actually it would be the same business appraiser that I would use for a litigated case.
Right.
And because we're not litigating, we can actually save a little money on that too. Instead of getting a formal report, the business appraiser will give us a range in a value for the business. Or sometimes the parties may decide, you know, we're getting divorced, but, you know, maybe we want to keep the business together, and they'll have an exit plan if that doesn't work out. There's so much you can do in a mediation context that you really can't do in litigation. For example, the business, if we go to litigation, the court's either going to say we're going to sell it or we're going to give it to one party or the other, and they're going to buy the other party out. Normally they wouldn't allow it to be in any other position. Somebody says, I want the business, the other one says, I want the business, the judge is going to say, well, we're going to sell it.
Right.
And that may be a result that no one is happy with, and actually might not be the best result for the ongoing concern of the business.
Right. And the same would be true with the house that we own. I mean, I assume that you would value the house, but there's, you can also then create alternatives and variables that typically a court's not going to deal with.
That is the thing that's very interesting with mediation. There are alternatives that I'm able to offer that the court can't. And for example, let's say it's a long-term marriage. In this case, husband decides to keep the house, but the house is upside down. And he's kind of doing wife a favor by staying there, and he's kind of happy with the house too, even though he's taking on a debt burden. But he says, well, I understand it's a long-term marriage and I need to pay some alimony, but this is going to be really difficult for me to pay what the court might order. So we can look at it and go, well, hey, he's got a nice 401k and she's entitled to half of that, but maybe we give her a bit more than half and work it out so either his alimony payments are reduced and she gets more 401k, and it may end up being a solution that everybody's happy with.
I would suspect that the most difficult part about this is with children.
Yes.
Right.
And in terms of children, we are able to, it's an interesting thing. If you litigate, you're forced, and you have children, you're forced to go to the Family Mediation Center. And I have nothing against them, but there's a big problem there, is when you go there, you can't talk about financial issues, namely child support. So, dad goes in and he goes, well, I'm really okay with mom having, primary physical custody, but I don't want to pay the child support, and if I agree to this, I have a big problem now. I have to pay all this money, and it's going to be very difficult for me. When you come into mediation, we don't really need to get so tied up in that. We have, NRS 125B.070, which basically specifies what the base amount would be, but we have all sorts of deviation factors, and in mediation, we can use them to a much greater extent than the judges ever would to come up with a result that, okay, so you agree that mom would have primary, but we're going to reduce it based on these other things that you're paying for.
Do you ever include the children in the mediation if the child's old enough? I know the courts don't really do that.
I do not. Although if the children are old enough, I can have the parents canvass them, without trying to convince them to go one way or the other. And usually in mediation, the parties are pretty open to the kids doing the right thing and doing what they believe is going to be not based on what the parents want, if they're like over 14. And usually they will hear about that, and then we just come up with an answer for the child support and make it work and give a good timeshare to the non-custodial party.
And this is done in an informal setting, right? So
Yes.
It's less threatening psychologically. And can you typically do this in one session?
I divide it normally up to 3 sessions, and they're 2-hour sessions. If there's custody involved, the first 2 hours we'll go through and resolve custody. Then the next 2 hours we'll resolve, if there's a number of assets, it'll be more than 2 hours. But if there's not that much, we'll resolve the assets and debts and any alimony issues in the next 2 hours. And then the last 2 hours we'll just review documents which will be filed.
If it doesn't work out, then obviously the parties go to court, they hire lawyers, the expense increases, etc. What kind of success rate do you have? I mean, out of every 10 families that come in to, well, let's try to resolve this as adult and as friendly as we can, out of 10, how many really accomplish that?
I would say it's over 9.
Wow.
9 out of 10. And the reason is, and I'll admit it, I do stack the deck in my favor.
What does that mean?
Basically, the only way I can do that is over the years I've been doing this for a long time. I came up with the set of questions that I indicated earlier, the 3 questions. Can you be in the same room? Are you both willing to disclose? And do you both feel strongly that you want to make your own decisions? And if the answers to that are yes, and I'll know it because I go over this with both parties, chances are we'll get it done.
Right. And when you say, are you willing to disclose, be honest about what's available financially, where your bank accounts are, where the assets are, that type of thing.
Right. And normally what I do see in mediation, which does make it a bit easier, is both parties do seem to have a good grasp on the assets and debts at issue.
Well, so when doesn't it work? I guess when somebody says no to one of those 3 questions.
There have been times, and it doesn't happen that often, but I try to screen it as best I can, where one party, I remember one case, I got everything done, and then out of the blue was some unreasonable request that, frankly, none of the judges would have ever granted. And I tried to repair it and get it back on solid ground, and nope, that wasn't going to happen. That one didn't resolve. Yeah. But I wouldn't be surprised afterwards if what we did put on the table ended up resolving the case.
Yeah, I would think it's so much more challenging now with the economy being what it is, and the mortgage problems, and the unemployment rates, and people are even if they want to resolve it, they don't know how to resolve it. You're offering alternatives and creative solutions. And I'm sure people are still fighting over pets and
people do fight. I kind of look at it this way: if both parties have an ounce of reasonableness, we can get it done.
Okay. And if somebody wants to get in touch with you,
if they want to get in touch with me, they can call my office at 702-384-9664, or look me up on my website, www.steinberglawgroup.com.
Okay, so hey, if you want to choose to try to resolve a domestic dispute without the costs and expense of not only hiring lawyers, but the time it takes, sometimes years going through the court, and it gets worse and worse and worse, you can contact Mr. Steinberg, see if you can get your things resolved your way. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Ed.
Be sure to visit us online for more information about today's guests, to see past shows, or even contact us about being on the show. Simply go to theedbernsteinshow.com. That's theedbernsteinshow.com.